Welcome to More Than Words, a podcast about treating the whole child brought to you by the Reading and Language Learning Center. I'm your host, Tristan, and today I'm joined by licensed psychologist, Dr. Carey Heller, to discuss ADHD and anxiety. Hi, Dr. Carey, how are you?
Doing well. Thanks a lot for having me. How are you doing today?
I'm awesome. We're excited for you to be here. And I think this is a really good topic, especially as we're getting started with the school year to jump into. Yeah. So let's start with an introduction. Tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Sure, absolutely. So I'm a clinical psychologist. I specialize in ADHD and executive function issues. Executive functioning is kind of an umbrella term that's often used to describe a variety of skill sets in terms of planning, organizing, task initiations, getting yourself going with things, using memory skills effectively. So most skills you would think about in order to complete a task, including homework, schoolwork, most other things for any of you listening, the things involved in actually getting yourself to find the podcast and hit the button to start it. So it's a very vital skill set. But I basically help people overall to be better organized, more productive, focus better, and really to thrive in life. I do therapy and coaching, formal testing to diagnose ADHD, learning disabilities, and related items, and also run an executive functioning boot camp.
Awesome. That's fantastic. And where are you if people are looking to find you?
Sure. So physical office is located in Bethesda, Maryland, near Montgomery Mall. I also am available in about 37 states online through SitePact.
That's awesome. Okay, perfect. So what is your website if people are looking for it?
Oh, sure. HellerPsychologyGroup.com.
Perfect. And I'll put that in the show notes. People will hear it and they'll also see it and they can click the link and stuff.
Perfect. Thank you.
Absolutely. So let's hop right in. First things first, what's ADHD?
Definitely a good question. It's always good to figure out, we're going to talk about something to define it. So attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, if you want to get very technical, the DSM-5-TR, it's the manual that clinicians use that has the criteria. It's classified in what's called a neurodevelopmental disorder, but sort of really what it is, it's a disorder that impacts self-regulation. So the ability of how well someone can basically focus their attention, their actions. So essentially, if someone needs to do something, it impacts if someone's really interested in something, they can probably focus reasonably well on it,
right,
if it's something they enjoy. But when you are presented with something that isn't really that enjoyable, for people with ADHD, it's often a lot harder to focus and do stuff. So for example, sort of a good example might be, a child can sometimes sit for hours playing video games, even if they have ADHD, but if they're interested in it, they may be able to do it quite well and focus. But, put the same child with, let's say, a math worksheet. If they really don't like math, have a hard time with it, the issues of focus are probably going to come into play there. So with ADHD, you have the issues with attention. And then some people with ADHD also have issues with hyperactivity, which is the idea of excessive movement. So the child that's, bouncing their leg up and down, that's fiddling with everything in sight, that just constantly has their hands in everything and can't sit still. Right. And also impulsivity. And impulsivity can be verbally in terms of, calling out in class, not being able to wait their turn to say something that's on their mind. Obviously, it can also involve actions in terms of doing things without thinking, which certainly as kids get older, I mean, even at any age can create issues, but obviously the severity of that can definitely, get worse or not the severity of the act, but, basically if you have a 5-year-old does something impulsively, chances are, they might get a little hurt worse case, but, certainly you put someone when they're driving or something like that, that's really impulsive, that can obviously create more significant issues. So it's definitely important to really address this stuff when kids are younger, if possible.
Right. Yeah, I don't think I realized the impulsivity part, because that is like something that I'm sure teachers are like, that disrupts my class or whatever. So that's interesting to mention, and that you could, I don't know how that is like worked with. I think I've heard more about like the hyperactive portion of ADHD and how people like try to work through that. So that, like I said, the impulsivity is interesting to me. But the other portion of what we're talking about today is anxiety. So do you mind going ahead and defining that as well?
So absolutely. So anxiety is really the idea of someone being, nervous about something. Mm-hmm. So something, kids and adults even can get anxious for different reasons. So especially with kids, sometimes it may be anxiety about a social situation. So when in a situation socially, especially with kids they don't know, they may kind of clam up
Right.
or they may, their heart may start racing, or they may, feel very tense. Same thing if they have an exam. Again, anxiety impacts people differently. Another common one is feeling overwhelmed when you have a lot to do. So,
Mm-hmm.
a child comes home, they're ready to start their homework, and they're so anxious because they have so much to do, and they feel like, oh, I can never get this done.
Right.
So there's, a lot. So anxiety can really have very different triggers. And that's why, when someone has anxiety, it doesn't always manifest in the same way.
Right.
Because, one of the things with ADHD and anxiety, and this is sort of interesting sort of in how because people can certainly have both, is that on the one hand, for some people, anxiety ends up actually helping aspects of the ADHD. And that for some people, it actually helps reduce the procrastination. Because if you're so anxious about getting stuff done, it may reduce the procrastination because you want to get it done.
Right.
Obviously, that's not always the case. There are definitely
Right.
lots of people with ADHD and anxiety where the anxiety worsens the ADHD symptoms and make it even harder to get started, because then you're procrastinating both because you have a hard time getting started because of ADHD, but you're also anxious and feel overwhelmed. So that also leads you to procrastinate. So it does. So again, that's where these things really, it's not one size fits all. That the symptoms can really impact people differently. And sometimes the interplay between anxiety and ADHD, again, can also impact kids quite differently.
Right. So that was what I was going to ask you next was, do they like often exist together? And is there a reason for that?
Yeah. I mean, it depends. Again, every child's, can be at least somewhat different. But, there are certain times where if someone has ADHD, at some point, there's some level of self-awareness to recognize, oh, I have a hard time focusing, or I'm not good at this. And so that of itself can sometimes, create anxiety, because if you go into a situation, you're not good at this, or whether that's, actual or good and accurate perception or not, it creates nervousness. So certainly the ADHD can over time, certainly create anxiety, but anxiety can certainly be there separate from ADHD as well.
Right. But with kids with ADHD, is the anxiety different than kids without ADHD?
I mean, certainly there's anxiety symptoms that are present if someone has anxiety. So that in itself would be different. But again, it depends. There are some people with anxiety and ADHD where the anxiety, reduces the procrastination piece and creates more of a sense of motivation to do something. Right. There are other cases where the anxiety causes people, can cripple kids and, they shut down. But then if you look at social situations, for kids that have anxiety in social situations, it's different, because sometimes ADHD, there's often this idea that they don't have a filter, that, the impulsivity of just saying whatever comes to mind. But if you're anxious in a social situation at the same time, that might actually reduce the impulsivity in social situations. Not always, because at the same time, sometimes when people are anxious, they may actually do things more that are impulsive because they're anxious.
Right.
So again, this is where there's all these different sort of possibilities of what could happen. But you take 2 kids, let's say you take 10 kids that have both anxiety and ADHD. The exact symptoms are going to be somewhat different because it can manifest quite differently. And with the anxiety, it also depends what the triggers are. For example, if social anxiety is not an issue and it's more anxiety about feeling overwhelmed, then that's going to manifest differently than someone that has, sort of a broader range of anxiety symptoms or triggers.
Right. So in terms of academics, how can anxiety and ADHD affect kids at school?
Sure. I mean, it definitely can impact them a lot.
I'm sure.
I mean, first of all, something you mentioned earlier about the idea of, the impulsivity and or hyperactivity in the classroom. A lot of times kids that have more of either the technically hyperactive impulsive kind, or oftentimes it's more under the umbrella of the combined presentation where they have inattention symptoms and hyperactive / impulsive ones. Those are often the kinds of kids that sort of teachers often recognize first in terms of having trouble because they're being disruptive in a lot of cases. Right. Whereas a child that just can't focus, well, obviously that's definitely a very big issue. A lot of times it's not as noticeable, especially when kids are a lot younger. So teachers don't pick up on it if the kid's not being disruptive.
Right.
But in terms of how it impacts the classroom, so, I mean, ADHD itself can certainly impact a child's ability to focus, to process and retain information. I mean, because if a child's sitting there and let's say it's a math lesson and they're kind of half zoned in, keep zoning in and out, they're going to miss parts. So they may not fully understand what to do, or they may think they understand it and then miss steps. Right. And then when they're actually doing the work, they may, miss, especially like stuff that involves a lot of steps. That can be especially challenging for kids with ADHD. Right. And if you don't really learn stuff super well to begin with, then it makes it a lot harder to really retain that information long term, or when it comes time to apply it, on an exam. So it can definitely impact learning a lot. Obviously, it can impact social relationships. It certainly can lead to conflict with teachers if they're being disruptive, especially because one of the things that's really hard is that you don't want to use it as an excuse. But if a child legitimately has a hard time controlling their behavior, and they keep internalizing and say, oh, I'm bad because I keep getting into trouble. That certainly doesn't feel good for the child.
Right.
But it's hard, especially if you don't really understand ADHD. A lot of times the teacher might say, oh, you have to behave better, you have to do this. And well, again, you don't want to use it as an excuse. It's hard because it's not like a child is intentionally choosing to act out or do something that's disruptive.
Right. Yeah. And do teachers often help identify that like a child has ADHD to the parents? That sounds like kind of confusing, but do they notice things and then they speak to the parent and they're like, hey, I'm noticing this in class?
I think it depends. I mean, there are definitely teachers that I think, especially when at least just anecdotally, when a child's being really disruptive and it's impacting a class, a teacher's probably more likely to say something to a parent, and try to address it. Or, I mean, certainly if a teacher is seeing something that's an issue, the hope would be that they'd mention it to the parents. Right. But, I think there are definitely some kids where, the teacher recognizes the issue, they bring it to the parents' attention, and the parents, figure out what's going on and address it. And then maybe it's they, do formal testing to figure out what's going on. In some cases, schools will do testing sometimes, or sometimes parents will go to a pediatrician as a starting point.
Right.
But, I think one of the hard things is that, there are lots of times where, I see kids where, teachers have said, oh, the kid's fine, or maybe they have a little issue with this, but it's not a big enough concern. But then, I do testing and there's quite a bit going on, or you look you put all the pieces together from year to year and look through the history, and there's a lot more than I think any one teacher realizes.
Right. So the parents, do they normally identify that before, like a teacher has to come to them, and what do they notice to finally say, like, I think my kid has ADHD?
I mean, oftentimes it's, issues with focus that, my child can't stay focused in class, or, I've, getting these reports from school that my child can't stay focused, issues with organization. So, a lot of times, especially when kids are younger, a lot of the teachers will have, you have to put the homework in this folder, or, have a organized binder in a certain way. And so a child has a hard time kind of following that system, or is constantly forgetting things, or has a hard time remembering to write down their homework assignment, or know what the homework is, or even using an online portal to keep track of assignments, to getting assignments turned in late. Those are definitely some of the red flags I see quite a bit, when a parent sort of comes for an evaluation, for their child for ADHD.
And for anxiety, or what do parents like normally see?
I mean, again, it can be, it certainly is different, but depending on the trigger of the anxiety. But, a lot of times it's feeling overwhelmed very easily. The idea that, little things just, having to transition one thing to the next can cause a lot of anxiety, or feeling overwhelmed every day after school when a child has to sit down and do homework.
Right. And is it normally like outbursts that parents see, or do they just get nervous and shut down? Like, what kinds of things do you hear very often? As
really, it's sort of both. I mean, there's some people, kids, teens, where they shut down and they just can't function because they're so anxious. There are others where they either redirect that anger, that anxiety into something else, whether it's, I don't know, sort of going at it with a sibling, or or sort of blowing up out of anger, which then sort of reduces having to deal with the anxiety of doing the homework.
Right. And do parents normally come in and say, like, if they're noticing both those things in their child, like get them tested for both of the things at the same time? Or do they just say, like, I'm noticing my child's having a hard time doing XYZ, and then they are diagnosed with both, but parents might not have noticed?
I mean, in general, when you do testing for ADHD, you really have to kind of look at everything to the extent that you can. So, for example, anytime I'm doing tests for ADHD, I'm automatically looking at, is there anxiety? Is there depression? If there's any other red flags that I would look at, is there OCD? Is there autism?
Right. Because
the hard part with kids is there's so much overlap. Because if you look at ADHD and anxiety, for example, hard time focusing or concentrating, that fits both of them. Shutting down when stuff's tough, that really is both of them.
Right.
Procrastination, both of them.
Right.
And when people talk about executive functioning, having a hard time with planning, organizing, getting started. So a lot of times people kind of associate executive functioning as the same as ADHD.
Okay.
I mean, the symptoms itself can often be quite similar, but at least the way that I view ADHD, if someone has ADHD, at least in my opinion, I feel like by default they have executive function weaknesses. However, the key thing here is that a lot of people can have executive function weaknesses without having ADHD. Anxiety can cause weaknesses in executive functioning, depression, because if someone's really depressed, they're going to have a hard time focusing.
Right.
If they're really depressed, I mean, their cognitive, the processing speed and stuff maybe slow down quite a bit. That there's a lot of functional impact. But even other things, I mean, OCD, for example, if someone has a hard time with if they're constantly ruminating about things, that's going to be distracting and have a hard time focusing.
Right.
If they're the obsessions and compulsions are taking up a lot of time during the day, that's going to impact their productivity with getting other stuff done they need to get done.
Right.
I mean, it's sort of funny. Like, I think, at least from my opinion, I think almost all psychological disorders in some shape or form probably impact executive functioning.
Right.
I've often joked when I've done presentations, find me a disorder that does not impact executive functioning at all. Just because the point is that I think it's such a vital skill, but I think almost anything can really impact it.
Yeah. And do you think that parents bring their child in for that reason, and then they're surprised by other diagnoses coming through with ADHD, or that like the child maybe has no ADHD at all, and it is one of the other things that impacts?
I think it depends. I mean, every situation is different. I mean, there's a lot of times where there's certainly a high comorbidity between ADHD and anxiety or ADHD and learning disability. So, I think a lot of times, like, when a parent sort of looks back through kind of the history and looks at what's going on, there's often not super surprised, but there's, I think for some people, there's certainly still stigmas attached to certain disorders. And so I think for some parents, it's especially if it's something that's completely unexpected. Like if I'm doing testing for, let's say, ADHD and learning disability, and it turns out, I see autism or OCD or something else that's really to them out of left field, that probably is going to be quite jarring. I mean, that's why I'm very delicate when I, do feedback sessions and handle it sort of, in a sort of, kind of a calm and sort of simple way as possible to navigate, because I think it's important not just to know what's going on, but to also look at when you give feedback, whether it's to the parents or to the child, how to do it in a way that is really empowering to them, so they come away from the evaluation feeling like, I now have all this information on what I have trouble with, and here's what I can do to make it better.
Right. And often parents get told, like, especially with what we work with, we do reading, and so a lot of times parents are like, oh, if your child's like having a little bit of trouble, like just wait, or like, and other things like with speech, they're like, my child's not speaking, should I wait? Do parents ever get told that with you? And do you try to, not by you, do you find that when parents come to you, they've been told, just wait, like, see if they'll like grow out of it?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of people that I work with where, they sort of wavered for a while, should I seek treatment? Should I seek testing? And this idea of, maybe I'll get better this year.
Right.
I think what's hard is, it depends on the circumstances. I mean, there are times where sometimes, people have issues one year based on a teacher or some other thing. Right. And, you start a new school year and it gets better. But in a lot of cases, unless it's something that really is set up in a way where there's likely to be a drastic change, most issues from the prior school year don't magically disappear when you start a new school year. Right. I think contrary to what I think a lot of people would like to have occur, that doesn't often happen. But I think also it's hard. I mean, obviously, as people develop in terms of reading level skills, things like that, at somewhat different rates. Yeah. I mean, again, I think there's a difference if we're talking about a kindergartner or a first grader versus a third or fourth grader. That there is some, and again, I think diagnose. I mean, even with ADHD, I'm really not a big fan of doing testing for real little kids, because I think there's especially in boys, there's a lot of kids that have a hard time sitting still and they're 4 or 5, and it doesn't automatically mean they have ADHD. Right.
I was going to ask, what is normally like the youngest you see come in to the office?
I mean, I've certainly worked with 4 and 5-year-olds before, but I would say probably, I don't know, maybe around 7 or 8 is probably the youngest that I most often see that comes in. But again, it's hard because I think with the learning piece, I mean, I can do testing with a 4 or 5-year-old or 6 or 7-year-old for to look for learning issues, but in some ways, the reading and the writing skills are still developing. Yeah. And so I can have some sense of what their current skill level is, but to me, like if they're a little behind, it doesn't automatically mean they have a learning disability. It means that maybe, there's a little bit, taking them a little longer to get the basics down of how to read. Whereas, and again, that's where I think sometimes, even if there's not a formal learning disability, certainly there's a difference between having learning disability and taking action to make it better. Because whether there's a learning disability or not, if your child's not reading the way that sort of you assume they should be, that's where at least seeking out early intervention to figure out what can I do to make it better. Yes. And I guess that's where you guys come in.
Yeah. It generally is where we come in. We tell people to get tested as early as possible. It's just the easiest way to know if there is something going on, because you can generally tell that. And and then you can go from there. But, if you get tested and you don't see anything, you can go on about your merry way. But a lot of times we do see kids wait until like later. But once you're in the middle school realm, it's hard to get caught up from, if you're in middle school and you have a third grade reading level, that's really difficult to build back up. So it's easier, just especially with reading, for getting a diagnosis as early as possible, because then you could just, improve the skills a little more on par with classmates, so the kids don't feel as behind. A lot of times kids with dyslexia are super, super smart, have very high IQ. So they feel, stressed in the fact that they can't read, and they feel like they're not smart, which is not the case.
Right. So it definitely impacts the emotional piece as well.
Yeah.
When someone's struggling with school. And so that's why I agree. I think getting the early intervention is really important. But also, like, if a parent, one of the biggest piece of advice I can really give to anyone, parents out there that are listening, is the idea that if you think your child might have a particular issue, at the very least, contact a professional and, talk to them. Even if like, there are definitely parents I talk to when they contact me about testing, I ask them, I don't just say, oh, let's do testing. I, ask them some questions. I get a feel for what's going on. And, in a lot of cases, I would say, based on what they're saying, I think we should do testing. But there are definitely a fair amount of times where I may say, based on what you've just described, I think, why don't we wait a few months, see how the new school year goes, and then to reassess. Or like sometimes if kids have gone through a huge life change in the moment, parents have gotten divorced or some other thing that actually could really be impacting things emotionally, it may not be the best time to do testing because you may not get as clear a picture of things.
Right. Yeah, that is interesting. I definitely didn't think about that as much. Because generally, like I said, when we get people calling to do testing, they're like, I've noticed my kid can't read. And it's like, they've noticed it for a while. It's less so.
Right. And again,
like
I also think that,
portion.
Well, obviously there could be an emotional piece to some degree to reading. I think it's more of a functional aspect.
Right.
It's more, I think, ADHD and the behavior certainly, I think, could have more of a psychological component to it in some ways than trouble reading. It certainly could have some, but again, it's, you also want to look at things globally. Like, so for example, when I do testing for learning disorders and reading, one of the things I also look at, to the extent I'm able to, is vision. Because there are a lot of times I'm referring out to, optometrists, because there are times where, even if it's not the primary issue, issues with vision tracking can sometimes really obviously impact reading a lot, and writing and other things too.
Yeah. And since we do speech, sometimes we do hearing testing too, because parents think that like their kid maybe just like isn't responding to things and they're confused by that. And you're like, okay, well, can they hear you? Like, we got to start there. Right.
And also the same idea that even if a kid can technically hear, how's their auditory processing? Because there's some kids that, may do okay in, super basic hearing test. But when you have to actually, listen to things that are, close by or far away or block out background noise, some kids have a much harder time with that.
Right. Yeah. Well, so that's why we started this podcast, because it's, treating the whole child. Like you said earlier, you got to look at everything. Otherwise you don't always get the full picture. And especially like you said, with executive functioning, a lot of, different psychological things can impact the executive functioning. So this is great. We're talking about this. So once kids get a diagnosis from you, let's say you've got a kiddo that gets anxiety and ADHD, what do parents normally do for therapy with you?
Sure. So certainly there's, again, it depends on, it's not one size fits all. So it depends. What are the actual issues at that point that they're seeing? So some of it would be, doing therapy to address the emotional impact. So self-esteem, things like that, then working a lot on practical strategies. So for example, with working on the hyperactivity, one of my sort of favorite things I like to focus on is this idea of harnessing fidgeting to improve focus. So the idea is, if a child is basically bouncing their leg or fiddling with things, clearly they need that excess movement and that's sensory stimulation. But if you can basically harness it in a controlled way, so for example, with doing homework, one of my favorite things to recommend for kids is to use like a desk bike or elliptical that they can pedal on while they're doing homework. Not for a high intense workout, but the idea is that if they're going to shake their legs anyway, by pedaling lightly while they're working, what it does is it tricks the mind into thinking they're more interested in something than they are, and so it essentially replaces that what otherwise would be kind of aimless movements that could be distracting and sort of channels it, so allows them to be more engaged and focused on whatever the task is at hand. But the idea behind it is it has to be mindless. So, for example, if anyone out here remembers fidget spinners,
Yes.
I think they were majorly mismarketed. I think a sign that they were on their way out was, I think a couple of years ago, I'd seen, I think, them on the clearance rack at, I think, Bed Bath & Beyond, which I guess I think it's gone out of business since. So I guess it's also dated. But but the idea is that you have to be able to do it mindlessly, because if you have to look at it while you're doing it, it's even if your auditory attention is fine, you're listening, you're missing all the visual cues. Right. So the idea is anything they're using as a fidget tool or device, even if it's on your hand, you have to be able to do it without looking at it or really thinking about it.
Right. One thing that I think is really interesting, I'm a knitter, and I feel like I've seen a lot of people knit in like classes, because they're like, if I can do something with my hands, then I can focus better. Has anyone ever been like, I would love to knit?
I mean, probably.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know as many kids that knit, and well, I certainly work with, boys and girls. I definitely end up seeing more boys than girls.
Okay.
Just the way it works out. But I've definitely people express interest in knitting. It's not as common as other things, but doing stuff with GIMP or things along those lines. And again, it depends how complex of a stitch it is in terms of how much they have to think about it.
Right. Yeah.
But knitting, I think, sort of the idea behind that, though, is because you need your hands. It depends what you're doing. So if you're sitting reading a book and you can have the book propped up and you don't need your hands or anything, something like knitting could work extremely well.
Yeah.
When you're doing something that involves your hands, and obviously with a computer, most times you need both hands to type. Mm-hmm. That's where doing stuff with your feet sort of can often be more helpful.
Yeah. And has there been, do people have like little like walking pads? Have you noticed that being another popular one?
I don't know that I've seen kids that I've worked with use the walkie pad. I think the idea is great. It's the same idea of the desk bike or the elliptical.
Right.
This is something you just stick under the desk and can do it. Right. I think it's hard. I think there's some people that can, or kids that can focus really well doing something that's sort of mindless, but others I've noticed sometimes have a hard time with the standing piece. Oh, so that's where another recommendation would be kind of like a standing desk and a balance board. Right. But for some people, the idea of having to stand up while they're working is sort of hard and creates a harder time focusing. So that's where something they can sit while, and basically the only difference is they're moving their legs as opposed to have to stand. But again, everyone's different. Yeah. I mean, using like a yoga ball chair or wobble chair, or other good things, because those sort of require at least a little bit of movement to hold yourself still. Right. But again, that's where, because everyone's different, trying out a couple of these things, seeing what works, for your child. But I also think getting their buy-in. So instead of just going out and buying all this stuff, to say, let's think through together, how can we make things better? So we've identified the problem is that you have a hard time seeing someone when you're doing homework. Right. So do you have, to ask them first, do they have any ideas on what they could do to make it better? And then, if needed, then offer, I've seen this desk bike you could use where you stick it on a desk and you pedal, while you're doing homework. Do you think this might be something worth trying? Yeah. And then this way, by taking a collaborative approach, I found a lot of times, you get more buy-in from kids. And so it becomes easier for them to try to use this stuff. Plus, also for a lot of kids, if they feel like it's very forced on them, they're going to push back, even if it's a great idea. Right.
Yeah. And do you notice that those things also help with the anxiety portion, or are there other tools that help with anxiety in the ADHD?
So it depends. I think for some people, the physical piece does really help with the anxiety also. Because, the other thing too is, going back to this idea how there can be a lot of overlap between ADHD and anxiety. When someone's really anxious, they can actually fidget because they're anxious. It's not always because of hyperactivity, because of ADHD. Right. So sometimes the physical movement can be really helpful, for the anxiety itself. Other times it's also just the act of it's one other thing that it creates something else to take, even unconsciously take their mind off of the anxiety to then make it easier to get started or to, tolerate those feelings. I mean, other strategies for the anxiety, certainly there are breathing techniques you can do, because if you think about what happens when someone gets anxious, again, there can be differences, but, some people, maybe their heart starts racing, or they may start, breathing really heavily, or they may feel very tense. So being able to, kind of slow, take control of the breathing to be able to bring your body back to homeostasis can sometimes be really helpful in, physiologically reducing the physical impact of the stress of this anxiety. Right. And again, these are things that are, best sort of done, worked with a mental health professional on, because you want to make sure you're doing stuff in a way that's safe and healthy. Mm-hmm. And, there obviously you can take a few deep breaths in and out. But I think, for anything more advanced, I think it's definitely best to work with someone directly on it, so you're doing it safely and also in a way that would ideally work well.
Right. Yeah. And do you often have like tips or anything that you give to parents or teachers so that they can better manage their ADHD and anxiety?
Yeah, I mean, in general, my approach is to try to help kids to do as much as they can themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Just because the more they can sort of be self-reliant for right reasons, I think that's better. But obviously, depending on the age and presenting issues, they certainly need at least some, if not a lot of support by adults.
Right.
And so the idea would be, for example, in school, to figure out based on the particular class, when might be a good time for a break. Because if you recognize that, X number of minutes approximately into the class period, a child, is having a hard time focusing and really needs a break or needs to get up, setting it up where, if there's a certain structure of the class where they could, take a quick break, let's say to get a drink of water or something where they're not going to miss instructional time or other stuff or minimize that would be best. So, making a plan for each class to get an extra break if needed, to be able to sometimes move to a different part of the room to do work. Those are, a couple of strategies that are often helpful.
Right.
A lot of it's figuring out like what are the issues that present in that class, because sometimes what may occur in a reading class may be very different than what occurs in math or science.
Oh yeah.
In terms of what the needs are, and so not everything is universal. I mean, it's sort of like with a 504 plan or IEP, it's great to have those accommodations in there, but sometimes if they're so general, unless you actually tailor them even informally to meet the needs of each class, sometimes they certain ones don't always end up being as helpful unless they're actually matched up. Like one of the things that in some cases I've seen, a reduced workload accommodation, which again, that's not as common. But the hard part is it really depends on the class. Like, for example, in a math class, I've seen that where sometimes it involves, doing all the odd number problems or less math problems. But in other classes, it's often much harder to determine what does that actually look like. And then half the time stuff's not implemented because no one's really sure how to actually implement it unless there's an actual discussion with the teacher about it.
Yeah. And that's tough. And what do you have any like quick tips that you would give a parent to help their kid maybe like do homework or something at the end of the day? That's not, because I'm sure a lot of times parents are like, you can do it, like, and they try to give encouragement in a way that maybe isn't the best for their kiddo because it's what they think would be helpful. So what do you normally say to them?
Sure. I mean, so I think to take a step back and kind of looking at, first of all, having a set routine that they can follow, that they're willing to sort of set up and use can be really helpful. So having, a plan, for based on the after school activities, when are they going to do homework? Are they going to come home and do it before they go out for an activity? Do they do it when they get home? But having a clear sense for each day of the week based on their schedule of when they're going to start homework would be good. Having a set space that they use ideally just for homework would be good. Because, if they do homework in the same place or watching TV or doing other stuff or playing the computer, it's going to be hard to train them to just do work in that area.
Right.
So I think that's sort of a good starting point. And then from there, figuring out, something along the lines of, if they need help, writing out a simple list of what assignments they're going to do. Like what I find helpful is for kids to, whether they do it through an online portal or, or paper planner, basically is to look essentially in some shape or form, have the assignments listed out that they're going to work on that day and estimate the completion times. Because what this does is they can tally that up and it gives them a sense of, oh, I need to focus for approximately 1 hour today.
Okay.
And it may not be exact, but basically it takes away that idea of the unknown. Because sometimes the idea of, oh, homework's going to take me forever can be a huge, deterrent to starting. But knowing that there's an actual time attached to it can sometimes make it easier to get started. Plus, also, if you have a child who's procrastinating a lot, if they have some sense how long the work's going to take, there's less likelihood they're going to leave it and then suddenly run short on time to finish it.
Right.
Especially if there's some sort of buffer beyond the actual time before they have to go to bed.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think that was my last question for you. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. Do you have anything you want to mention before we wrap up here?
Sure. I guess one thing to mention in terms of online resources. So Chad is a really great resource for everything ADHD. They have, hundreds of thousands, or actually more than that, of articles online. They have various toolboxes based on the presenting issue around ADHD. And so you can download, podcasts, all sorts of stuff. So it's a really great resource for pulling at, everything you can about ADHD if you need sort of a good online resource for stuff.
Okay. That's awesome. I don't think I've heard of that. You said it's called Chad?
Yeah, it's CHADD.org.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a national nonprofit that's really focused on helping people with ADHD.
Wow. Okay. I'll definitely put that in the show notes. I think that would be awesome for parents to be able to use. Yeah. I'm trying to think of anything else. I think that was it. Well, this was wonderful. Thank you so much for being here and chatting with us about this. Like I said, I think it's great for the start of the school year. Parents that I'm sure are like you said, where they wait for the school year to start and they're like, maybe something will change next school year. This will probably be at the perfect time for people to be like, you know what, nothing did change. And hopefully they'll give this a listen and see what steps they need to do moving forward. So thank you so much for being here.
Hey, welcome. Thanks a lot for having me.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much to the audience for listening. Make sure to subscribe and leave us a little rating and review. It helps other folks find the podcast, and we'll chat with you next time.